The cold was not a passive thing tonight. It was a predator. It moved through the cracks of the city like a living entity, seeking out warmth to strangle. Inside apartment 4B, the temperature was barely higher than the freezing air outside. The radiator clanked a hollow, mocking sound of metal on metal, but produced no heat. Sarah sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, her breath pluming in front of her face in short, terrified bursts. She was 24, but in the dim, flickering light of the single bulb hanging from the ceiling, she looked much older. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them bruised by exhaustion. In her lap, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, was Barnaby. He was a Mixam terrier, some spaniel, all bone and trembling heart. He was only 4 months old. He whined, a high, thin sound that vibrated against Sarah's chest. He sensed the tension in her muscles, the way her hands gripped the fabric of her coat until the knuckles turned white. "It's okay," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "It's going to be okay, baby." A heavy fist pounded on the door. The wood groaned under the impact. Barnabas scrambled, letting out a sharp bark of fear. "Open up, I know you're in there." The voice belonged to Silas Vance. It was a voice like grinding gravel, devoid of pity, heavy with entitlement. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking. She moved toward the door, not to open it, but to plead through it. "Mr. Vance, please. I get paid on Friday. I told you," the shift manager promised. The door didn't open. It exploded inward. The lock, already loose in the rotted frame, gave way with a splintering crack. Silas Vance filled the doorway. He was a large man, encased in an expensive camel hair coat that looked obscenely clean against the grime of the hallway. Snowflakes dusted his shoulders, not melting, but sitting there as if the man himself generated no heat. Behind him stood 2 other men-hired muscle, silent and grim. "Friday isn't today, is it, Sarah?" Vance said. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the meager possessions with a look of utter disgust. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the space she occupied, calculating its value per square foot. "I have half," Sarah stammered, backing away, clutching the puppy tighter. "I have half the rent right now. Please, look at the window. It's a blizzard out there. You can single quotes T. Vance laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, sharp exhale. "This isn't a charity ward. This is a business, and you are bad for business. You complain about the heat. You complain about the rats. And now," he pointed a leather-gloved finger at the dog, "you bring a beast into my property. No pets allowed." Section 4, Clause B, "He's not a beast," Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "He's a puppy. I found him freezing in the alley behind the dumpster. I couldn't leave him, and I can't leave you here," Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low timbre. "You're 2 weeks late. The lease is void." He snapped his fingers at the men behind him. "Get her out. Everything out. No. You can't do this legally. You need a court order." Sarah screamed, backing into the corner. Vance stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke choking her. "I am the court in this building, darling. And if you want to wait for a judge, you can wait on the sidewalk." He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising. Barnaby lunged. The small puppy, terrified but driven by an ancient instinct to protect, snapped at the leather glove. His tiny teeth found purchase on the thumb. Vance roared. He didn't pull back. He swung his hand, backhanding the small dog. Barnaby yelped. A sound of pure penand went flying across the room, hitting the peeling wallpaper with a sickening thud before sliding to the floor. He didn't get up. He just lay there, whimpering softly, curling into a ball. "Barnaby!" Sarah shrieked, tearing herself free from Vance's grip to scramble toward the dog. "That's it," Vance spat, inspecting his glove. "There wasn't even a scratch. Get them out, now. Use force if you have to." The next 5 minutes were a blur of violence and chaos. The 2 men grabbed Sarah. She fought, kicking and screaming, her fingernails raking against their jackets. They dragged her toward the door. She watched helplessly as Vance kicked her duffel bag, containing her whole life, into the hallway. Then, Vance walked over to the puppy. He picked Barnaby up by the scruff of the neck, holding him like a piece of garbage. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "Don't hurt him, please. I'll go. Just give him to me." Vance walked to the open door and threw the puppy into the dark hallway. Barnaby scrambled on the linoleum, claws clicking frantically, trying to run back to Sarah. The men shoved Sarah out. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the dirty floor of the corridor. Vance stood in the doorway, the warmth of the hallway light silhouetting him like a demon. "The locks get changed in 10 minutes, he said calmly. "If I see you in the lobby, I call the police for trespassing. If I see you in the basement, I call the pound to kill the rat." He slammed the door. Sarah scrambled to Barnaby, scooping him up. He was shivering violently, his ribs heaving under his fur. "I've got you," she sobbed. "I've got you," but she didn't have him. She had nothing. They stumbled down the stairs, the wind already howling through the broken front door of the building, waiting to swallow them whole. The city of Chicago was disappearing. The snow was falling so heavily it erased the skyline, turning the world into a grey, swirling void. The wind chill was 20 degrees below zero. It was the kind of weather where exposure meant death in under an hour. Captain Elias Thorne gripped the steering wheel of his Ford F-150. His knuckles were white, matching the scars that ran up his forearms, souvenirs from 20 years in the fire department. He was off duty, heading home after a 48-hour shift that had drained the soul right out of him. They had lost a family in a row house fire yesterday. The image of the empty crib, the smoke-stained walls, was burned into his retinas. He drove slowly, his headlights cutting futile cones of yellow into the white darkness. He took the shortcut through the industrial district, a maze of old brick factories and tenement buildings that the city council liked to pretend didn't exist. The heater in his truck blasted hot air, but Elias felt cold inside. He felt the specific, heavy cold of a man who has seen too much death and is starting to wonder if saving people is just delaying the inevitable. He stopped at a red light on 5th and Kennedy. The intersection was deserted. The traffic light swung wildly in the gale, a ghostly red eye blinking in the storm. Elias looked to his right. There was a dilapidated apartment complex there, the Rookery, the locals called it. A place where desperation went to pay rent. Movement caught his eye. It was subtle, just a darker shadow detaching itself from the gloom of the building's entrance. Elias squinted, wiping the condensation from the inside of his windshield. A woman, she was stumbling out of the doorway, pushed by the wind. She wasn't dressed for this. She wore a thin denim jacket and jeans that were already soaked through. She was carrying a bag in one hand and clutching a bundle to her chest with the other. She took 3 steps onto the sidewalk and collapsed. It wasn't a gentle fall. Her leg simply gave out. She crumpled into the snowbank, curling around whatever she was holding. "Hell no," Elias muttered. The light turned green, but Elias didn't move forward. He threw the truck into park and flipped on his hazard lights. The amber flashing rhythmically illuminated the scene. He opened his door and the wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He grabbed his heavy turnout coat from the passenger seat. He hadn't even bothered to take it inside, yet and threw it on. He ran. His boots crunched heavily through the knee-deep drifts. "Ma'am," he shouted, his voice torn away by the wind. She didn't move. The snow was already covering her, weaving her into the landscape. Elias reached her. He dropped to his knees, the cold seeping instantly through his jeans. He grabbed her shoulder and rolled her over. Her face was pale, terrifyingly so. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were open, staring up at the swirling snow with a glazed, vacant look. Hypothermia was setting in fast. The confusion phase. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm a firefighter. I'm going to help you." She blinked slowly. Her eyes focused on him, but there was no recognition, only terror. "He, ... double quotes," she mumbled, her teeth chattering so hard the words were shredded. "The heat, ... he, ... we need to get you inside," Elias said, reaching to lift her. Then, the bundle in her arms moved. A small, wet nose poked out of the blanket. 2 dark, terrified eyes looked up at Elias. The puppy let out a sound that broke Elias's heart, a whimper, that sounded more like a human child crying than an animal. Elias felt a surge of rage so hot it almost melted the snow around him. Someone had put them here. This wasn't an accident. No one walks out into a blizzard like this with a puppy, unless they are running from fire or forced by a monster. "Okay," Elias said, his voice steel. "Okay, I've got you both." He didn't wait for permission. He scooped Sarah up in his arms. She was dangerously light, frail bones and shivering flesh. She clutched the puppy so tight Elias thought she might crush it, but he understood. It was the only warmth she had left. He carried them back to the truck, shielding their bodies with his own massive frame against the biting wind. He shoved them into the passenger side, cranking the heat up to the maximum. As he ran around to the driver's side, he looked back at the building. On the second floor, a curtain twitched. A man was standing there, watching. He held a glass of something amber in his hand. He watched Elias put the freezing woman into the truck, and he didn't move. He didn't call for help. He just watched, like a scientist observing an insect dying in a jar. Elias memorized the window. He memorized the face. He got in the truck and slammed the door, locking out the storm. But the storm inside him was just beginning. The cab of the truck was silent, except for the roar of the heater and the ragged, hitching breathing of the woman. Elias drove fast, but carefully, heading not to the hospital, but to Station 42. It was closer, only 4 blocks away, and he knew the crew on duty. He needed to get her core temperature up immediately, and the ER waiting room would be a zoo on a night like this. "What's your name?" Elias asked softly, keeping his eyes on the treacherous road. "Essera," she whispered. She was huddled in his turnout coat, the heavy, fire-resistant material swallowing her small frame. She had pulled the puppy inside the coat with her. "I'm Elias. You're safe now, Sarah. You and the little one." She started to cry then. As the warmth of the truck began to thaw her frozen nerves, the pain of the cold and the trauma of the eviction came rushing back. It was a guttural, ugly sobbing that shook the whole seat. "He threw us out," she choked out. He threw us out." Elias tightened his grip on the wheel until the leather creaked. "Who?" "The man in the window." "Vance, the landlord," he said. "He said I was bad business." Elias knew the name. Silas Vance, a slumlord with a file at the fire marshal's office thick enough to choke a horse. Code violations, illegal subdivisions, bribery accusations that never stuck because witnesses had a habit of disappearing or recanting. They pulled into the station bay. The massive red doors rolled up, revealing the warm, brightly lit sanctuary of the firehouse. Elias parked and helped Sarah down. The on-duty paramedics, Miller and Ortiz, were already walking over, alerted by Elias's radio call. "Hypothermia risk," Elias barked, slipping back into his command voice. "Check the girl. Check the dog." They ushered her into the triage room. Ortiz, a tough woman with gentle hands, immediately began wrapping Sarah in warm blankets and checking her vitals. Miller, a younger guy who loved dogs more than people, took Barnaby. "He's hurt," Sarah cried, trying to reach for the dog as Ortiz checked her blood pressure. "He hit him." Vance hit him. Miller placed the puppy on the exam table. Barnaby was shivering, his tail tucked so far between his legs it was touching his stomach. He favored his left side. "Ribs feel bruised," Miller said quietly, his face darkening. "Maybe a fracture, and he's got frostnip on his ears and paw pads. But he's a fighter, Cap. He's alert." Elias stood in the doorway, watching them work. He saw the bruises on Sarah's wrist finger marks. Distinct, violent finger marks. "He put hands on you," Elias stated. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, clutching a mug of hot tea with both hands. "He dragged me. I told him I had the money. Or half of it. I told him about the wiring." Elias froze. "The wiring." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide and haunted. "The walls, ... they hum. And sometimes, when you plug something in, there are sparks behind the outlet. It smells like burning plastic. I told him 3 times. I told him I was scared to sleep at night. He said if I didn't like it, I could leave. And then tonight, he made me leave." Elias looked at Miller. Miller looked back, his eyes wide. "Captain," Miller said. "That building. The Rookery. We did an inspection there 6 months ago. The basement was a labyrinth of extension cords and bypassed fuse boxes. The marshal ordered a shutdown, and Vance paid a fine and claimed he fixed it," Elias growled. "But he didn't fix it. He just evicted the people who complained," Sarah whispered. "Mrs. Higgins in 3C. She disappeared last month. He said she moved to Florida. But she left her walker behind." A cold chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard went down Elias's spine. This wasn't just an eviction. This was a cover-up. Vance was clearing out the liabilities. He was churning through tenants, squeezing them for cash, and tossing them before they could report the death trap he was renting them. And tonight, with the blizzard raging, the load on the electrical grid would be at its peak. Everyone in that building would have their space heaters on full blast because the radiators didn't work. "Sarah," Elias said, stepping closer, his voice urgent. "How many people are in that building right now?" "It's full," she said. "Families, kids. The Martinez family is right above me. They have a newborn." Elias looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m., the coldest part of the night. The heaters would be running red hot. The overloaded, rotted wiring inside the walls would be cooking. "Miller," Elias said, turning to the paramedic. "Keep them safe. Don't let them leave." "Where are you going, Cap?" Miller asked, though he already knew the answer. Elias grabbed a fresh radio and his helmet. "I'm going back," Elias said. "That building isn't a home, it's a bomb, and the fuse is already lit." As he walked toward the truck, the radio on his hip crackled to life. "Dispatch to Station 42. Structure fire, reported at 5th and Kennedy. Multiple calls, occupants trapped. Heavy smoke showing." Elias stopped. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He wasn't in time to stop it. "Dispatch, this is Captain Thorne," he shouted into the mic. "Sprinting for the engine. Strike a second alarm. Roll everything you've got. We have a mass casualty situation." The nightmare had started, and the man in the window was watching it burn. The Rookery was not just burning, it was screaming. As the heavy pumper truck skidded to a halt on the ice-licked pavement of 5th and Kennedy, the scene was a chaotic masterpiece of hell on earth. The blizzard, fueled by gale-force winds coming off the lake, acted as a bellows. It drove the oxygen deep into the rotting heart of the tenement, whipping the flames into a frenzy that defied physics. The fire wasn't moving up. It was moving sideways, punched through the shattered windows by the wind, looking like dragon's breath against the swirling white snow. Elias hit the ground running before the truck had fully stopped rocking. The heat was a physical wall, an invisible impact that instantly vaporized the snowflakes landing on his face. "Hydrant," Elias roared, his voice cutting through the roar of the inferno. "Get me a line on the Bravo side. Search and rescue, Team 1, with me. We have confirmed entrapment on floors 2 and 3, but the city was fighting them. The hydrant on the corner was buried under 5 feet of plowed snow." Miller and the Rookie, distinct in their clean yellow turnout gear, were frantically digging with shovels, their movements jerky with panic. "It's frozen, Cap," Miller shouted, kicking the iron cap. "The stem is seized." "Use the tank water," Elias commanded, not breaking stride. "We don't wait for water. We go in dry if we have to." He grabbed a Halligan bar and an axe, the tools feeling light in his adrenaline-flooded hands. He looked up at the building. The second-floor window, the one above where Sarah had lived, was glowing a dull, angry cherry red. A scream tore through the night. High up, on the 3rd floor, a woman was leaning out of a broken window. She was holding a bundle. "The Martinez, baby, please," she shrieked, the smoke billowing around her head like a dark halo. "Help us, ladder." Elias screamed into his radio. "Drop the stick to the 3rd floor, Alpha side, now." But the wind was gusting at 60 miles per hour. The aerial ladder on the truck swayed dangerously as the operator tried to extend it. The hydraulics wind fighting the gale. It was too slow. Elias looked at the front door. The lobby was filled with black smoke, the kind that indicates incomplete, combustion, toxic, superheated, and ready to flash over. "Masks up," Elias ordered his team. He pulled the regulator of his SCBA mask into place, the seal clicking shut. The world narrowed to the sound of his own ragged breathing and the muffled roar of the fire. He kicked the front door. It held. He swung the axe, the blade biting deep into the wood. He swung again, and the door splintered. Elias stepped into the throat of the beast. Visibility was zero. He was crawling on his hands and knees, feeling the heat radiating through his thick gloves. The carpet was melting, sticking to his gear. "Sound off," he yelled into his mask. "Torres, behind you. O'Malley, with you." They moved like a centipede, low and fast. They reached the stairwell. It was a chimney. Flames were licking up the banister, curling like vines. Elias checked the thermal imaging camera. The screen was awash of white and red, but halfway up the stairs he saw a shape, a blue blob in the sea of orange. A body. "Victim on the stairs," Elias shouted. He lunged forward, grabbing the leg of a man who had tried to flee. He was unconscious, overcome by the smoke. Elias grabbed the man's collar, dragging him down the stairs, passing him back to Torres. "Get him out. I'm going for the baby." Elias turned back to the fire. He was alone now, climbing into the furnace. The heat alarm on his pass device began to chirper, warning that his gear was reaching its thermal limit. He ignored it. He reached the second-floor landing. The heat here was intense enough to crack the lenses of his mask if he stayed too long. He crawled toward the apartment directly above Sarah's unit. He could hear the baby crying now. It was a weak, wet sound. He reached the door, locked. He jammed the Halligan bar into the jamb and leveraged his weight. The door popped open with a groan. A wave of heat rolled over him, pushing him flat to the floor. He crawled inside. "Fire department, call out." Nothing but the crackle of burning timber. He swept the room with the thermal camera. There, in the corner, huddled in a bathtub. 2 heat signatures. He scrambled toward them. It was Mrs. Martinez, curled over her infant. She wasn't moving. Elias grabbed her. She was heavy, dead weight. He couldn't take both at once. He grabbed the baby, tucking the infant into his coat, against his chest, shielding it with his own body. Then he grabbed the mother by the strap of her nightgown. "Come on," he grunted, straining every muscle in his back. "We're going home." He dragged them toward the door. The ceiling above them groaned. A beam, eaten away by the fire, was sagging. Elias threw himself over the mother and child just as the roof came down. The impact was like being hit by a train. Debris rained down on Elias's back plaster. Burning wood, molten insulation. His helmet took the brunt of a heavy beam, the composite shell cracking with a sickening snap that rang in his ears like a gunshot. For a moment there was only darkness and the high-pitched whine of tinnitus. Elias gasped, inhaling a lungful of hot, acrid air as his mask seal broke for a second. He coughed, a violent spasm that racked his bruised ribs. He shoved the beam off his legs, his turnout pants scorched black. He checked the bundle in his coat. The baby was silent, but he felt a small chest rise and fall against his own. Alive, he checked the mother. Mrs. Martinez was groaning. She was alive, but trapped under the drywall. "We have to move," Elias rasped, resealing his mask. Now he pulled her free. The hallway was gone. The stairs he had climbed were a flaming ruin. There was no way down. The fire escape. Elias dragged them to the back window. The glass was already shattered. Through the smoke, he could see the iron grating of the fire escape platform. He climbed out onto the metal grate, the wind instantly freezing, the sweat on his skin. He pulled the mother and child out after him. "Command." Elias shouted into his radio. "I have 2 victims," sighed Charlie. "Second floor. Stairs are compromised. We are on the fire escape. Copy, command. Hold tight. Ladder is repositioning." Elias looked down. The alley below was a wind tunnel of snow and sparks. And there, standing in the safe zone of the alley entrance, illuminated by the flashing strobe lights of the trucks, was Silas Vance. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't crying. He was on his phone. He was pacing, gesturing angrily at a police officer, pointing at the building. Elias looked at the fire escape door next to him, the one leading to the 3rd floor, where more people were trapped. It was closed. And through the grime-streaked window, Elias saw the heavy silver gleam of a padlock and chain wrapped through the push-bar handles on the inside. Horror, cold and absolute, washed over him. The tenants on the third floor hadn't died from the smoke. They had died because they ran to the exit and found it chained shut. A landlord's solution to keeping junkies out of the hallways. A tomb. Elias grabbed the railing of the fire escape to steady himself. Then the metal screeched. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was the sound of rusted bolts shearing off from rotting brick. The fire escape hadn't been inspected in a decade. The weight of the snow, plus Elias and the victims, was too much. No, Elias whispered. He lunged for the window frame, hooking his arm through it, grabbing Mrs. Martinez's wrist with his other hand. The platform swung away from the wall. With a terrifying metallic groan, the entire fire escape structure detached from the second floor. It swung down like a pendulum, slamming into the brick wall of the first floor. Elias held on. His shoulder screamed as his socket nearly dislocated. He was dangling from the window frame, holding Mrs. Martinez, who was dangling over the drop. The baby was crushed between Elias and the wall, crying thinly. The fire escape below them crashed into the alley, a twisted heap of iron. If they had been on it, they would be dead. "Hold on," Elias roared, his grip slipping on the woman's wrist. Her skin was slick with soot and sweat. "Don't let go." She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flames from the window above. "My baby," she choked out. "Save my baby. I've got you both." But he didn't. He could feel her hand sliding. His glove was wet. The physics were impossible. Below, in the alley, Silas Vance looked up at the sound of the crash. He saw them dangling. He didn't run to help break their fall. He didn't shout encouragement. He stepped back. He stepped back to avoid getting hit by falling debris. "Help me!" Elias screamed at the firefighters running into the alley. "Catch her!" His fingers slipped. Mrs. Martinez fell. It was only 20 feet, but she hit the frozen, debrillated ground hard. She didn't move. "No," Elias bellowed, a sound of pure agony. The ladder truck finally swung its bucket around. Strong hands grabbed Elias, pulling him and the infant into the safety of the cage. As they lowered him down, Elias stared at the body of the woman in the snow. Medics were swarming her, performing CPR, their compressions rhythmic and desperate. Elias looked past them. Silas Vance was still on his phone. He turned his back on the dying woman and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the storm. Elias had saved the child, but the cost was etched into the frozen pavement, and the man responsible was walking away. The fire was out. The beast had been starved, leaving behind a skeletal, steaming corpse of black brick and ice. The morning sun was rising, a pale, sickly yellow disk behind the grey clouds. It offered no warmth. The scene was silent now, save for the idling diesel engines of the trucks and the crackle of police radios. Elias sat on the rear bumper of Ambulance 61. He had refused transport to the hospital, allowing the paramedics to treat his burns and wrap his ribs right there in the cold. He held an oxygen mask loosely in one hand, but he wasn't breathing from it. He was breathing the air of the aftermath, that distinct smell of wet ash, burnt plastic, and death. He felt hollowed out, a husk. Mrs. Martinez had been pronounced dead on arrival. The trauma from the fall, combined with smoke inhalation, was too much. Her baby was in the NICU, critical but stable. An orphan created in a single night of greed. 3 other bodies had been found on the 3rd floor. Just behind the chained door, Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash. They were stained black with soot that no soap would ever fully wash away. He rubbed his thumb over his palm, feeling the phantom sensation of the woman's wrist slipping from his grip. "I dropped her." The thought played on a loop. "I dropped her. Cap." It was Miller. He looked young, his face streaked with grime, tears making tracks through the soot. "The marshal is here," Miller said softly. "They're asking for a statement." "Tell them to check the back door," Elias said, his voice a rasp of broken glass. "Tell them to check the chains. Tell them to find Vance. Vance is already talking to the press, Miller said, looking at the ground. He's over by the command post. He's Cap, you need to see this. Elias stood up. His knees protested, but he ignored the pain. He walked around the perimeter tape. A news crew had set up their van. Silas Vance was standing in front of a camera, looking solemn. He had even managed to squeeze out a few tears. It's a tragedy, Vance was saying into the microphone, shaking his head. I told those tenants repeatedly not to use space heaters. I warned them about the dangers. You try to provide affordable housing in this city. You try to help people, and they don't listen. It breaks my heart. Elias stopped. The rage that filled him was so intense, it made his vision blur. The man was rewriting history while the bodies were still cooling. He wanted to charge him. He wanted to wrap his hands around Vance's throat and squeeze until the truth came out. But he couldn't. He was a captain. If he attacked a civilian, even a monster like Vance, the narrative would shift. Deranged firefighter attacks grieving landlord. Vance would win. Elias turned away. He couldn't watch it. He walked back toward the station, his boots dragging in the sludge. He walked into the station bay. It was quiet. The heavy mood of failure hung over the crew. He went to the triage room. Sarah was still there. She was sitting on a cot, wrapped in a wool blanket. She looked up when he entered. Her eyes were red, swollen. She had heard the news. She knew her neighbors were dead. She knew she was alive only because of a fluke of timing, because Vance had been cruel enough to kick her out before the fire started. Did you save them? She whispered. Elias leaned against the doorframe, unable to stand upright anymore. I tried. I couldn't. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. He put his head in his hands. The sobbing started deep in his chest, a dry, painful heaving. He had been a firefighter for 20 years. He had seen death, but this wasn't death, this was murder. And he felt complicit because he hadn't saved them. I'm done, he whispered to the empty air. I can't do this anymore. Then he felt a wet nose against his ear. Elias froze. He turned his head. Barnaby, the puppy, had limped off the cot. He dragged his back leg slightly, favoring the bruised ribs, but he had crossed the room to get to Elias. Barnaby didn't bark. He just pressed his small, warm body against Elias's heavy turnout coat. He licked the soot off Elias's cheek. He let out a soft sigh and rested his chin on Elias's knee. The dog was in pain. He had been thrown into a wall. He had been thrown into the snow. He had lost his home. But he wasn't giving up. He was offering comfort. Elias looked at the puppy. He saw the resilience in those dark, soulful eyes. The dog didn't know about lawsuits or insurance fraud or corrupt landlords. He just knew that Elias was sad, and that meant Elias needed him. Sarah walked over, her blanket trailing behind her. She sat on the floor next to Elias. She put her hand on his shoulder. You saved us, she said fiercely. You stopped for us when everyone else drove by. You saved Barnaby. You saved me. Elias looked at the dog, then at Sarah, then back at his trembling hands. The despair was still there, a heavy stone in his gut. But the heat of the dog against his leg was a tether. It held him to the earth. He lied, Elias said, his voice hardening, shifting from sorrow to something colder. Vance lied on camera. He blamed them. He's a monster, Sarah said. Monsters win when we quit, Elias murmured. He reached out and stroked Barnaby's soft ears. The puppy leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. Elias took a deep breath. The smell of ash was still there, but now he could smell the dog, Tua, smell of life, of survival. He stood up slowly, wincing as his ribs shifted. He helped Sarah up. He picked Barnaby up gently, tucking him into the crook of his arm. I'm not quitting, Elias said. He walked to the window of the station and looked out at the smouldering ruins of the rookery. I'm not just going to put out the fire. I'm going to find the source, and I'm going to burn it down. The rock bottom had passed. The ascent was about to begin. And this time, Elias wasn't bringing a hose. He was bringing a war. Elias was a ghost in his own city. Officially, he was on administrative leave, resting after a traumatic event. Unofficially, he was a man possessed, operating in the cold shadows of the investigation. the fire marshal's office, bound by procedure and the whispers from the city council, had ruled the Rookery fire an accidental electrical failure, closing the case. But Elias knew the chains were real. He knew the look in Vance's eyes. He spent the next week in the burnt-out shell of the Rookery. The site was freezing, the melted ice locking the debris into sharp, black mountains. He was searching for the truth that procedural reports had missed, accompanied only by the biting wind and the endless creak of ruined timbers. He wasn't alone in his disbelief. Elena Roselles, a city inspector with a quiet fury for injustice, contacted him. She had a file on Vance, stretching back 15 years, code violations ignored, illegal evictions, insurance payouts that always smelled of fraud. She had been watching Vance for years, waiting for the one slip-up that would stick. "I found this in the debris," Elena said, meeting Elias one frigid afternoon behind the station. She held up a clear, heat-warped plastic bag. Inside was a piece of metal. It was a section of a heavy chain, rusted and twisted, with one shackle end fused shut by extreme heat. "It's from the third-floor fire exit," Elias confirmed, his voice rough. He recognized the specific thickness of the industrial chain. It was new. He used it to lock the tenants inside. "And look at this," Elena said, pulling out a smaller piece of metallar. Small, distinct piece of melted brass. This wasn't a cheap lock. This was a high-grade security padlock. He installed this specifically to keep them from using the emergency exit. But the marshal's office still wouldn't move. They had no witnesses, and the chain, without a confession, could be spun as post-fire damage. They needed a connection. They needed the intent. Elias needed a break, a sign that the universe hadn't completely abandoned them. He found it late one night, sitting at his kitchen table, watching Barnaby. Sarah had been staying at the firehouse dorms, officially listed as temporary support staff to explain her presence. Barnaby was recovering slowly, his limp still pronounced, but his energy returning. He had become Ilias's quiet sentinel. Barnaby was lying on a dog bed next to Ilias's feet, gnawing on a bone. Suddenly, the puppy stopped. His ears twitched. He let out a low, focused growl, staring intently at the corner of the room. "What is it, buddy?" Elias murmured, reaching down to stroke his head. Barnaby ignored the touch. He focused on an old backpack Elias kept in the corner, a worn, heavy leather bag that Elias used for rescue gear. Elias realized the dog wasn't growling at the bag. He was growling at the sound coming from the bag. The puppy was sensitive to sharp, high-frequency noise. He was reacting to the sound of the wind or the hum of a weak light fixture, the same hum Sarah had. Mentioned in her apartment, Elias had an old audio recording from the fire scene, taken by the command post camera before the equipment melted. It was a loop of the fire's roar. Elias played it back, amplifying the non-fire noise, the wind, the sirens, and a subtle, high-pitched thrum, a specific, electrical buzzing. It was the humming Sarah had complained about. It wasn't just faulty wiring. It was the sound of a major, stressed load. It was the sound of the illegal heating system Vance had put in place. Cheap, powerful booster unit meant to bypass the cold radiators. Elena found the source, a specialized commercial heating relay that Vance had purchased and installed himself. A unit so powerful it was only approved for industrial warehouses, not residential buildings. Vance wasn't just cheap, he was using an illegal, highly combustible method to avoid fixing the central boiler. The hum was the sound of a cheap fix waiting to explode. He created the conditions for the fire, Elena whispered over the phone. The chained door was just to make sure no one survived to report the truth. Elias looked down at Barnaby, who was resting calmly, the fire noise gone. The dog hadn't just saved Sarah from the cold. The dog's trauma had pointed them toward the motive. "We have enough for a search warrant," Elias said. "We hit his office. We find his ledger. We find the paper trail that proves he bought the chain and the illegal relay." "I'll get the warrant," Elena promised. "But Jack, Vance will know the second the judge signs it. Be ready." Elias looked at his jacket, hanging by the door. His turnout gear, he put his hand on Barnaby's head. "We'll be ready," he confirmed. The city was preparing for another storm. The sky had turned that ominous, bruised violet color, promising ice and chaos. Elias was supposed to be at the courthouse, waiting for the search warrant to clear. Instead, he was racing across town, driving his truck like a bullet. Alina had called him, her voice ragged with fear. Vance hadn't waited for the warrant. He had anticipated the move. He had gone straight for the primary witness. He found her, Elias. Elena screamed into the phone. Sarah called me. He showed up at the temporary shelter. He knows she's the only one who can place the chain on the door. Elias sped toward the Sheltara safe house 20 minutes away, established by a local charity. He pulled up to the large, anonymous brick building. There were no lights on. Silence. The terrifying, heavy silence of a scene that is already over. Elias slammed the truck into park, leaving the engine running. He pulled out the only weapon he possessed, the Halligan bar, heavy and familiar in his grip. He breached the front door with a single, brutal kick. The hallway was dark. Sarah, he roared. Barnaby. He heard a crash from the kitchen. He sprinted toward the sound. The kitchen was a mess. A table was overturned. Sarah was huddled in the corner, shielding her face with her arms. Standing over her was Vance. He wasn't wearing an expensive coat today. He was wearing a dark windbreaker, and his face was tight with cold desperation. In his hand, he held a shovel knot, a professional tool, but a small, heavy piece of metal used for fireplace ashes. And then Elias saw Barnaby. The puppy, despite his injuries, despite his fear, had positioned himself between Vance and Sarah. He was crouched low, letting out small, broken snarls, the sounds of a creature who knows he is outmatched but refuses to surrender. Vance swung the shovel, not at Sarah, but at the dog. "You worthless little beast." Vance shrieked. "You ruined everything." The shovel caught Barnaby on the flank, the point of impact muffled by the dog's fur, but the force sending a terrible jolt through the small body. Barnaby yelped, a sound that ripped through Elias. The puppy collapsed, lying still. The darkness and the shock of Chapter 5, dropping the woman, returned with crushing force. The image of the body on the pavement. The memory of the first kick. Elias didn't pause. The rage was immediate and focused. He charged across the room. Vance saw him, his eyes widening in pure shock. He swung the shovel toward Elias's head. Elias ducked under the swing, bringing the heavy Halligan bar up in a quick, practiced motion. He didn't aim to strike. He used the hook end, catching the metal shovel and tearing it from Vance's grip with a vicious wrench. The shovel clattered away. Vance stumbled back, grabbing a chair. "Stay back, Thorne. This is trespassing. I'll call the police." "Call them," Elias growled, holding the Halligan bar like a weapon of justice. "Tell them you just tried to silence a witness. Tell them you just attacked a firefighter." Vance was breathing hard, his fear turning into cornered animal panic. He lunged, not toward the door, but toward a small duffel bag he had dropped near the counter, his tools. Elias saw the glint of metal inside the bag. A gun. Elias reacted instantly, using his professional instincts. This wasn't a fire, it was a structural collapse of morality. He didn't swing the bar. He thrust it, using the sharpened spike on the opposite end, jamming it into the linoleum floor, right in front of the counter. The Halligan bar was now a static obstacle, a steel barrier anchored to the earth. Vance tripped over it. He went down hard, his head hitting the tile floor with a dull, echoing thud. The air rushed out of him. Elias didn't wait. He pinned Vance to the floor with his boot, grinding his heel into the man's ribs. "The chain," Elias snarled, his voice low and deadly. "The illegal relay. The 3 people who died in the stairwell. Did you do it?" Vance whimpered, unable to breathe. "No, I didn't mean to." "Did you chain that door?" Vance screamed, a high-pitched, pathetic sound. "Yes, yes, to keep the riffraff out. It was just business." Elias leaned down, his face inches from the man's. It was murder. Elias heard the approaching sirens, then Alina and the police, arriving with the warrant. He stepped off Vance, his chest heaving, his body bruised, but his spirit whole. He dropped the Halligan bar. It hit the floor with the sound of finality. He didn't look at Vance again. He rushed to Sarah. He rushed to Barnaby. The puppy was whimpering softly, struggling to stand. Elias scooped him up gently. Barnaby rested his head against Elias's neck, a small, trusting weight. "It's over, buddy," Elias whispered, burying his face in the soft, thick fur. "You won. We won." Justice, Elias realized, was not always a judge's gavel. Sometimes it was the sound of a puppy's heartbeat. The conviction came 6 months later. Silas Vance, confronted with the evidence, the ledger confirming the purchase of the illegal relay, the recovered chain, and Sarah's unshakable testimony of the electrical hum and the violent eviction, was sentenced to life without parole. The charge, multiple counts of manslaughter and aggravated assault. The system, once shielded by money, had finally cracked under the pressure of irrefutable, painful truth. Sarah, healed physically, but marked forever by the trauma, was given full compensation, and a foundation started in the name of the Martinez family baby, offering safe housing to low-income families. Elias didn't return to the fire department right away. He took a leave of absence, dedicating his time to fighting for better housing codes and stricter enforcement against slumlords. He became the voice for the voiceless, the man who knew the difference between an accident and a crime of apathy. He didn't need the badge to be a protector. Barnaby, miraculously, had healed fully, though he carried a permanent, slight, limper reminder of the cost of his loyalty. He was now fully grown, a handsome dog of sturdy build and deep, knowing eyes. He was Elias's service dog, Sarah's best friend, and the true foundation of their new life. Elias bought a small house outside the city limits, a place with a huge yard and a quiet wood stove. Sarah moved in, and together they formed a different kind of family, built not on blood, but on shared trauma and mutual rescue. One clear autumn morning, Elias sat on the porch, watching Barnaby play in the crisp, golden sunlight. Sarah was inside, setting up a new office where she worked remotely for the charity the community had created for her. Barnaby bounded over to Elias, a stick gripped proudly in his jaws. He dropped the stick at Elias's feet, then sat, his eyes wide, waiting for the game to begin. Elias picked up the stick and threw it hard, watching the dog sprint across the wide green lawn. The scars, the fear, the smell of the fire, they were still there, faint echoes on the edges of memory. But they no longer defined him. They were just part of the story. He watched the powerful, joyful dog running through the sunshine, a living symbol of resilience and determination. Barnaby had been thrown into the snow and fire, but he never stopped protecting his family. Elias smiled, a genuine, deep expression of peace. He had found his purpose, not in the grand gesture of saving a life, but in the quiet, day-to-day commitment to protecting a small, brave heart. The greatest truth of the story, Elias knew, was that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stop. Stop the truck, stop the indifference, stop the monster. And then hold the line for the ones who cannot hold it for themselves. He settled back in his chair, watching the dog. The sun was warm on his face. The world was quiet. There are always more stories in the darkness, waiting for someone to stop and look. If you find yourself still listening to the silence, perhaps you are meant to be the one who tells them.